Hello, Evan J. Lawson here. Welcome back. Today I want to talk about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. So off the back of my last video, The Beginner's Guide to Opera, I had some friends tell me that they'd watched the video and found it really fascinating, and they wanted to know what I would suggest on a similar vein for new music. So I am a composer and a conductor, and my interest and passion lies in performing and championing contemporary classical music, what we call new music. And this friend of mine was like, why don't you do a video about that? And I hadn't even thought of it, which is crazy because it is, like, as I said, one of my favorite things and really what has defined my career so far. And I started thinking about it, and I was like, this is really necessary, but it's also a very big challenge, because I want these videos to very much be if somebody who has never stepped foot in a concert hall, or might have just a little bit of an understanding, wants to get into opera or new music or whatever, that they can come watch this video and have sort of somewhere to start. With new music, it's really difficult kind of doing that because you can't really have the conversation without assuming that the person you're speaking to has some slight understanding of classical music and music in general. So I'm going to probably say some things that are pretty broad, and I'm probably going to miss out a lot of things. Like it's definitely going to be composers and styles and thinking that I might not touch on. One example is improvisation, and that within new music, improvisation and free music making is integral and very important, but it's not something that I really know much about or engage with. So a lot of the recommendations I'm going to make are ones that I love. So it's also just a passion list from me, but it's also a list that's informed mostly from what we would call notated composers. So already we're going to start on some concepts that might be a little foreign, and I have to like tease out a few things. So apologies that this isn't just like, here's some pieces that you should start with, and if I blab on too much, well, I'm sorry. I also want to acknowledge before I start delving into that if you are looking for a more like really in-depth study of new music, this book here, Modern Composition and Culture, Music After the Fall, the idea is that it's looks into musical trends in contemporary classical music and culture in general after 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I've kind of put together this list in a similar way, with one exception. So I'm mostly suggesting composers that are predominantly still alive and still working. So this is kind of the challenge. New music could be defined as being, some people define it as music that was written after the Second World War and onward, which is crazy because like that was so long ago now. But that is still kind of, you kind of can't talk about the music of today in terms of what occurs in a concert hall and in a contemporary classical music setting, which again, I need to kind of explain what that is as well. You kind of can't talk about that without talking about the music that was created after the Second World War and the aesthetics and the guiding lights that happened then. So like, what is contemporary music? What is contemporary classical music? What is new music? What are these things? So I define new music as being music that is new. It sounds really rudimentary, but when you start talking about classical music, it's like, there's so many terms. It's like contemporary classical music, new music, avant-garde, like all of these things. New music could be film music. It could be music written for the concert hall, so for an orchestra or a string quartet or a singer. It could be new opera. It could be a piece of theatre. It could be the music that you hear in a TV ad. Like, it's so many things. But for the purposes of this video, I probably should define it as being, as I said, notated music written for orchestras, opera companies, Western performing contexts. Now, that's not to say that people on this list, I've tried to include people from different countries, different cultural backgrounds, different ethnicities and races. So it's incredibly complex because it's like trying to explain what humanity is. It's so broad and there's so much going on and there's so many different styles. Rather than talking about styles in terms of the list that I've made, which I will touch on styles in a second, but rather than talking about it in those terms, I didn't want to do that because I personally try and come at all music, regardless of when or who wrote it, in the same way. I don't want to put one composer above another. I want to experience any music from the ground up. I don't want to come at it and be like, I want to experience this music because it was written by Beethoven, or that because it was written for as an opera. I want to try and, where I can, experience it as much as possible from the music and get that reaction. So in my creative endeavors, I've obviously trained at a high level to appreciate and understand music, but I've always tried to keep at the forefront just a little bit of spontaneity, in that I don't want to know everything. I want to try and make sure that music is always fresh and that I'm never kind of anticipating or expecting something. Hopefully this list is a really interesting cross-section of different composers, trends, styles, approaches that will be rewarding to listen to and to engage with and spark your ability to have an in with new music. So in terms of aesthetics, the two kind of big hangovers of music of the past, say 30 years, has been music that was created after the Second World War. The big trends, that is. So that's like pop music is really important because, after the war, recordings and the access to albums and LPs and radio was obviously really influential, and so a part of that was the growth and birth of popular culture and mass culture. The other big influence is probably neoclassicism. So what that means is composers in the 20s and 30s were looking back at styles and composers, say like Mozart, and writing in a kind of imitation style. So you often get composers writing sort of imitative composition of previous eras, and that obviously influences their musical language. The third big influence is the music and work of Arnold Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School. So this was a group of composers in Vienna at the turn of the century who wanted to completely change the system and the way that music was written. And through that, they created a system that's called the 12-tone system, which is like dissonant, basically. And the idea behind it is that they wanted to change the way that musical structures could be made. They didn't have to be based on Western European traditions that had come before. The funny thing is with that group, and it was very influential still on music of today, and I'll get to that, but the funny thing is that a lot of those composers were so informed and really thought that what they were doing through this new technique was informed so much by the past, but through that they created this new avant-garde, which after the Second World War boomed. And so a big trend still in contemporary music is this kind of desire to create something shocking or something new, whatever that means, or something uncomfortable or awkward. And I personally feel that kind of sensibility for composers was born out of the Second Viennese School. You could say in a similar way that abstract painting can be traced back to Cubism and Picasso. So it's tricky, like painting, it's incredibly broad and huge, and you just start talking about one thing and you have to talk about 50,000 things. So those two things, neoclassicism and serial dissonant, if you will, composition, are two huge sort of pillars after the Second World War. Of course, those two things are also tied up in politics, and I think politics is really important, and the politics of the Cold War. So if you're talking about music since the end of the Cold War, the 90s, the noughties, and now, I have put this list together rather than, as I said, in terms of genre. I've put it together in terms of kind of trends. So I've got some composers that focus, and again, I should say, it's not to say that these composers just focus on this thing. They focus on different things and do all sorts of things. Most composers now are working composers. They can't just sit in their room and write a symphony. They need to be working on film or television, or they have collaborative projects, or they work with a particular performer, or they are a self-performer, they write for themselves. You know, it's like the composer is like any artist or any one really in contemporary life, where you do totally different projects all the time. So I've got some composers and works that deal with politics. I think that's a really important trend in many varying ways. I've got some composers that deal with contemporary life and the ramifications of that. I've got some composers that deal with philosophy, and then I've got some examples of works and composers that are multi-genre and deal with non-music collaboration and are primarily at their core, I would say, more theatrical, theatre-based work. Again, that's not to say that any of these composers don't do things in the other, but it's just sort of the only way I could kind of put a list together. Going back to the aesthetics thing, as I said, new music is so broad, so you might have a composer who writes in a style that's like minimalism. Minimalism is very important. Aroused in the late 60s, early 70s in America, similar to minimalism in other trends of art. It's about very simple, very repetitive structures and forms and musical ideas. That has been very influential. So you might get a composer that writes very much in that style, and I have composers on this list that do. You might have a composer that's born out of the Darmstadt summer school sort of pathway, which the Darmstadt school is a yearly summer course in Germany that was in the 60s and 70s, the main place that all the avant-garde composers who wanted to write really wild, crazy, unorthodox, new music would go to. And the hangovers of that aesthetic and that approach are still being felt today, even though Darmstadt is still changing and has different approaches. But there's composers on this list that sort of fit into that kind of vibe. There's this push for what's called new simplicity, which is sort of almost neo-romantic and looks back to composers of the 19th century and some composers of the 20th century who didn't fall into any of these kind of clear defined groups. There's so many different interesting trends. As I said before, improvisation. There's composers that relish and use that. There's composers that notate music, like myself and like the people on this list. As I said, they're mostly dealing with notated written music. So as you can tell, it's like a Pandora's box. I could talk about this for hours. So I'm gonna leave that kind of discussion around aesthetics and the world and just talk about the music. So the first composers I've got are in this kind of politics thing. And the pieces I've chosen, there's the playlist for this above, the link above. A work by Liza Lim, who is an Australian composer who I have very luckily had the opportunity to have a lesson with, and I know Liza and I think her music is remarkable and incredible, and also the composer Julius Eastman. So these two works, Liza's piece deals with, it's called Extinction Events and Dawn Chorus. So it's dealing with the environmental issues we're facing at the moment. And Liza's work is incredibly varied. It focuses on a lot of different cultures and how that, especially in Australia, interplays with like Indigenous cultures, Asian cultures, and that wrapped in with sort of politics, and really she has incredibly well-read and beautiful references of poetry and literature. So it's an incredibly evocative work. It's really amazing audibly, but also visually. It's a very dramatic piece. It's written for a mixed ensemble, so that's quite common in new music, that you have this ensemble or band of like say 10 to 20 musicians. So I would say a large majority of contemporary classical music is performed by these groups, the London Sinfonietta, Ensemble Moderne, Elysian Ensemble here in Australia, my ensemble, Forest Collective. They're a large mixed group of instrumentalists working with composers. Some of them may have like a stylistic kind of approach, but often they're pretty diverse and are working with different composers on different projects. Some projects may be just a concert of music, some projects might be multimedia, multidimensional, performative, sometimes they're improvisation. So this is a good example of that sort of way of thinking, which is very prevalent in new music. The other piece in the playlist is by Julius Eastman. Now this is the work that it's a bit earlier, it's from like the 70s. And this work is, I believe you can pick the number of instruments. Like in the recording, you'll see there's like 8 or so instruments, clarinet, saxophone, some string, whatever. But I think in this piece, Julius Eastman is like, you can pick whatever instruments you want. And that's something that's been quite influential, this kind of idea of choice and chance, so that a piece of music isn't necessarily written for the piano and it always has to be on the piano. It could be that you could play it on a clarinet or you could play it with a string quartet, whatever. So it's got this like flexibility built into the piece. Julius Eastman, I think, is also important to highlight because he was a queer black man and was very political and very loud in his compositional practice about the inequalities that he faced. And he's a composer that I find really fascinating to read about, and I always want to highlight him and show him to people, and I think he should be listened to. So the politics, yeah, there's a lot of amazing contemporary music made about political issues, and composers are always passionate and fiery about their politics, and yeah, you can't really escape it. There's a lot of work that deals with contemporary issues. The next is sort of related to that. It's about contemporary life and composers that are responding to contemporary life. And I have two sort of very contrasting examples. One is a composer who, in just saying his name, people will probably think it's like there's new music diehards who probably like laugh at me and think it's passé to even mention this person's name in a new music list. And that's why I want to do it, because it's like, as I said, I try and listen to music and have a reaction to it as authentically and as without any kind of baggage. I don't want to not listen to a piece of music because a certain composer wrote it or comes from a certain genre. People should make those decisions for themselves. His name's John Tavener. He's no longer with us. John Tavener wrote music, probably most famously had a piece of music performed at Princess Di's funeral, and writes predominantly choral music. And he's an interesting one about contemporary life because he didn't like the life he led in the UK and this sort of hustle and bustle of modern life. And he was really into different religions and trained in Russian Orthodox Church, and I believe like maybe in the Byzantine Church or something, like went all over the world to these different church practices and different music, church musics, and created a style that is incredibly beautiful and incredibly deep. And this work in the playlist I've given is one of his largest works and very well known. I think the recording actually went to like in the top 10 recordings, like pop chart recordings. Like it was a huge hit in the 90s, and it's called The Protecting Vail, and it's a concerto for cello and orchestra, and it is stunningly beautiful and very very poetic and beautiful. And he talks about trying to write feminine music and music that isn't in a way, I guess he's sort of reacting to this like avant-garde, hardcore, masculine thing that was very much a focus of the 20th century. The other work is very much a contemporary life-inspired work, again from the 90s, by the amazing American minimalist composer Steve Reich. It's called City Life, and it's a work that is multi-dimensional because it's not just a work for orchestra. It has audio and visual that goes with it. Steve Reich is very much caught up in the minimalist tradition and was there at the forefront in the 60s and 70s, and I strongly recommend his whole output. But this work in particular really focuses on New York City and his life in New York and the life of people living in cities. Steve Reich creates work that sits sort of almost on the cusp between, say, like multimedia and the concert hall. He sort of sits in this really cool in between, and he's got a lot of works for recorded voice that he manipulates through. Back in the day, it would have been cutting magnetic tapes, but now, of course, we can do it digitally. So he's a really fascinating composer to look into. The next group of composers are, I've sort of bundled them in this kind of like philosophy. So again, of course, any art is sort of tied so closely with philosophy. And of course, all the pieces I've mentioned are tied in with philosophy, but I like this idea of like philosophy and deep listening. So there is a lot of music, especially from the minimalist tradition, composers like Arvo Pärt or Henryk Górecki, that tie into this idea of spirituality and mysticism and this whole kind of push for, music that is meditative. And a lot of this music pops up on like yoga playlists and meditation playlists and that sort of thing, which, again, some people might poo-poo it and think it's a bit daggy, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that minimalist music, and through that contemporary classical music and contemporary music in general, has played a role in culture. And so a composer I've given an example of is Max Richter, who some people may know is an English composer. He's quite famous for like meditative, beautiful solo piano music. And I include Max Richter for that kind of deep listening aspect, but also because he ties into this sort of pop music crossover with people like Olafur Arnalds, and those sort of like usually Scandi solo piano players. He has that similar vibe, and a lot of those composers work with or influenced by Max Richter. It's also a lot of cinematic film music as well. So Max Richter has a lot of really fascinating, interesting projects, one being this work called Sleep, which is an 8-hour work that you, as an audience member, sleep to. The other piece I've included is by a composer I adore, Japanese composer Toru Takemitsu, and it's called What Flows From Me Is What You Call Time, and it's this large orchestral work, and again, this including him in this sort of little category of philosophy is because he's an interesting one, because he brings this deep sense of Japanese culture, of the Japanese tradition around art and the importance and the power of what art is in Japanese culture. But he is trained and performing and creating work in what is essentially a Western tradition. And this work, so it's beautifully influenced by, quote unquote Eastern religion, but it has a language that's very much informed by French music making of the 20th century. The final category I've got is works that are multi-genre and theatre. So that's a very commonplace thing with works. A work like the Takemitsu is very much a standard orchestra work that you go to a concert hall and you listen to a really big orchestra play a piece of music. These works are works that perhaps don't take place in a concert hall. They may take place in a theatre or a warehouse, and it involves projections or video art or performance art. It's an area of work that I gravitate to a lot. So the three composers, we've got a very, very different stylistically. We've got Michel van der Aar, who I find really fascinating. He studied with Louis Andriessen, who is sort of the spearhead of minimalism in Europe. So Michel van der Aar's music, it sits in a similar kind of vibe to like Steve Reich, but has a very different sort of flair to it. I've included two recordings. One is a pop song collaboration thing he did with Kate Miller-Heidke, the Australian singer, and I wanted to include that because a lot of people will know Kate's work, and she works a lot with Michel van der Aar. And then the other piece I included is called One, which is an opera, which can be performed live, but I only know it as a movie, and it's also written, it can be written to be performed live, but I think it was originally intended to be this movie. So the trailer of the movie is on. And so Michel is also a filmmaker as well as a composer. So he creates these really cool works that bring together technology, and it could be film, it could be, he's got a piece with like a dictaphone where the violinist records themselves, plays the dictaphone back, and has to perform with their past recorded self. And these really cool works that bring, yeah, like analog technology, digital technology, theatre, the traditional concert hall, all these things together, and creates some really fascinating pieces. So One is attached here, so you'll see in it the singer has to perform with videos of their previous recorded self. So it's really cool, has this really multi-layered thing. Chaya Czernowin is a composer from Israel based in America. She works at Harvard University and has produced some really cool operas. So the video here, there's also an interview with her, is this large-scale opera project from last year. And she works a lot with opera singers and opera performers, of course, and theatre makers, orchestras and musicians, both in notation and providing them with semi-improvised material. So she might give them instructions that leads them to improvise. And then this sort of third thing of electronics. So it's another big trend in a lot of contemporary classical music, is pairing live analog instruments with digital instruments. So they may be pre-recorded sounds, and that's digitally manipulated, and it has like a click track that the performers play with, or it may be a microphone that feeds into the instrument, and that sound is performed and is edited through a system, or it may be edited live by an operator. So yeah, it's an area that I have conducted works in, but I haven't necessarily written in. I don't know a huge amount about it because I'm a bit of a technophobe, but it has produced really cool music, and her music is some of the best, I think, of bringing in the sort of element of live instruments and electronic manipulation, either pre-recorded or done in the space. And then of course this work is a theatre piece, so it's very evocative, very cool. And the final composer I've got listed is Du Yun. Du is a young Chinese American, I believe, composer. She's Chinese and lives in the United States. Her music is ticks all the boxes really of the previous examples, but this work in particular I really like. String quartet with a video. Her work is, she's done some projects around cultural identity, and especially obviously the China-America relationship is so important at the moment, so she sits in a really fascinating place for that culturally. And I just find her projects and her presence really interesting because she's not coming at the concert hall from a traditional European or Anglo perspective. She's got a freshness and an excitement about her work for those avenues that's really refreshing and really exciting. She's got like a great Instagram and stuff like that as well. You know, there's I feel not a lack of snobbery and a real freshness towards music making and what music making can be, and that it isn't just writing a string quartet, that it's working with different people, it's collaborating, it's making work that's outside the concert hall and outside classical music. And so that's why I have included Du Yun. I hope you have found this interesting, illuminating. If you're someone who is heavily engaged and knows about new music, let me know in your comments about like music that you like, pieces that other people should listen to, pieces that I should listen to that I might not have heard, and let me know if I said the wrong things, because like I said, it's easy to make broad statements about any art, but especially art that is still living and breathing and finding its feet. And yeah, I hope that you listen to these works, watch these works, and experience some new sounds that you might not have heard we will see you next week for another video. Bye.